Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So, last book of the Arrows trilogy. Last book of the series trilogy, pardon me, that started it all. And this one I'm going to try to remember whether or not I do as anybody's guess, because I just freewheel these. I'm going to try to remember to finish this off with a quick discussion of By the Sword. Because you may remember my saying that By the Sword starts before Exile's Valor, starts after the Vows and Honor trilogy, duology plus short stories, whatever, and goes all the way through past the end of the Arrows trilogy. Well, we're continuing that attempt at simultaneity, and hopefully I'll remember to talk about that at the end of this. So, Arrows Fall. Now, anybody who's wondering about Arrows of the Queen, it's actually explained in the book. There are two reasons why. First of all, because heralds are known as the Arrows of the Queen because they are supposed to act as messengers, flying like the arrows they are known for down the roads. Very dramatic. The other thing, and this becomes a key plot point in this book, although it is first brought up in the second one, is that they are supposed to take the fletching on an arrow, that is, you know those feather things at the back end of an arrow that you have the pointy bit, the head at the front, and then you have the shaft, that is the long bit, and then you have the fletching, which is the feathery bit at the back. And fletching is there to stabilize an arrow in flight. It's like the tail portion of an airplane, which is kind of sticky-outy, and that stabilizes things. It acts as not so much a rudder, but as a thing that controls and keeps things stable in the air. And that a herald is supposed to learn a couple of patterns for their arrow. That is, you learn the pattern, your own pattern, and you learn the pattern of your partner. And the idea is you learn how to break the feathers, the fletching at the back of the arrow, into a particular pattern, kind of like a Morse code. And what you can use then is you can use those arrows to leave messages for people. They are sent with some banded arrows that if you have an arrow with X or Y color of band, it means this, and the fletching is in your pattern or your partner's pattern. The idea being, this is a message saying a healer is needed. This is a message saying danger ahead. This is a message saying whatever. It's very simple. The last messages are an arrow with the head broken off means a dead herald, and an arrow snapped in half is supposed to mean mission has failed, do not attempt rescue. And so Arrows of the Queen sets us up describing who these Arrows of the Queen are. Arrow's Flight is Talia's internship. Arrow's Fall is Talia's mission that she goes on with Herald Chris. And she's had a tough time upon coming back because the rumors have been rife, because Chris's uncle, Lord Orthalon, has been trying to undercut Talia's authority. He turns out to be a villain. And a whole bunch of things happen, and Talia gets sent away near the end of the book after a whole bunch of various things, including a whole bunch of wibbling about Harold Dirk, because he is her soulmate, they are life bonded, and Dirk becomes convinced that Talia and Chris are an item even though they're not, and he goes out of his way to avoid them and starts drinking too much and gets himself pneumonia and a whole bunch of other things. Anyways, not really pertinent. The Arrows Fall refers to the end when Talia and Chris, they get sent on a mission to the neighboring country of Hardorn, whose king is attempting to get his son married to Queen Selene of Valdemar's daughter, who's also been kind of a subplot in this because Elspeth was Selene's daughter by her husband, and her husband was, after all, the guy who tried to have her killed, and Alberic had to assassinate him. This came up. But anyways, Selene, in a sort of semi-wisdom, had absented herself from Elspeth's life in a lot of ways because she was worried about treating her daughter badly or not treating her properly because she would see too much of her ex-husband in her. But the nurse Hulda had done this whole thing to try to turn Elspeth into a little monster. Talia had managed to get to Elspeth before then, but anyways, and I don't mean a literal monster, I mean a figurative one, spoiling the girl, teaching her that she ought to be various things as the heir, and so on and so forth. Well, Elspeth has been recovered, has been chosen by a companion, but Selene doesn't want to marry her daughter off too young, and so Talia and Chris get sent on a diplomatic mission to sort of set the stage over to Hardorn to find out what King Alisandar's son Ankar is actually like. Well, when they get there, they find out what he's like. He's a warmongering psychopath who murders his own father, because King Alisandar is apparently a really nice guy, and Ankar doesn't want to wait for the throne, so he has his father murdered, takes over. Chris is killed, and Talia is tortured, rather horrifically. There's a lot of stuff in there that is not described in any detail. It's blurry watercolors, but it is very clear that it is horrific. And the key with the arrows is that she gets the message out by a friend of hers, somebody who is a trader, that is, does what it says on the tin. They carry stuff to trade stuff with people. She gets 2 arrows to him to send with Roland, her companion, back to the Queen to warn them, and sends 2 arrows, one with Chris's pattern with the head broken off, that Chris is dead because he has been killed, and the second one with her pattern with the arrow shaft snapped in half, saying, "Mission failed, do not attempt rescue." And we get to, and that is very much the climax of, in a lot of ways, you have this as the climax of the book, because she sends that message and it guts Dirk, because Dirk is life bonded to her and Chris is his best friend. Chris is practically a brother to him. And Talia sends that message, and Dirk uses his telekinesis, fetching they call it in this book, and with the help of Elspeth, who farsees, that is, she has a magical talent that allows her to basically find stuff far away and look at it, and a bunch of companions effectively acting as boosters, manages to rescue Talia. And that's really that's very much the climax, because following this is at least 2 or 3 chapters of just Talia's recovery, of them talking through things, of a whole bunch of stuff, including a bit of hardcore telepathy healing that they used to get Talia over the fact that she was raped, yes, raped, really, really fast, which is kind of a cheat on Mercedes Lackey's part, where she's like, well, we have telepaths who can go in there and telepathically fix this kind of psychological damage, so whoosh, she's better. It's a bit of a cheat, but I appreciate that she actually did address it at the very least. She says, yeah, she would be horribly traumatized. That's why she sends Dirk away and then works really, really hard with, another mind healer to fix all of these problems before Dirk gets back, so that Dirk never has to deal with the fallout. So here's the thing. By the Sword picks up basically a couple of weeks afterwards. Like you have part 1 of By the Sword, which is Kerowyn finding out that she really shouldn't be staying at her father's castle, that she needs to, and getting herself effectively apprenticed to her grandmother Kethryveris' friend Tarma Shena Talasedrin. Part 2 is her time as a mercenary and her various misadventures and her meeting of Eldan, who is in fact her soulmate, her life bond. And then we get to part 3. And part 3 of this, as I said, picks up right after Arrow's fall. And the reason we know this is because early on in part 3, section 3 of this book, Kerowyn is at the King of Rethwellan's home that she is visiting. She's spending time there, and one day at a major feast, 2 heralds come walking up. It's Talia and Dirk. And Talia has clearly only just recovered from the whole mess that she went through at Ankar's hands. And they arrive there to plead with the King of Rethwellan to send them reinforcements, to send them defenders, to send them somebody to keep Ankar from rolling right over Valdemar, because he's going to, because they simply do not have the resources to fight him off. They are not a warlike country, they don't practice conscription, and now they're in a bind. And when King Faramantha hesitates, what happens then is Kerowyn brings up a story that her grandmother and Tarma had told her. And it's a story that comes up in Oathbreakers, and that is that the then king of Rethwellan told the man who was then the crown prince of Valdemar, that if at any time Valdemar wanted to call on Rethwellan for assistance, that they could do so, that they would be honor bound to do it. And Kerowyn stands up and says, I'm going to ask you to live up to this oath that you made in front of my grandmother in this very hall, this oath that was made by your great-grandfather in this hall. And it forces Faramantha to act, it forces him to send troops. And it turns out that Eldan, who is pictured here on this cover, as I said the last time we talked about this book, has also said that Kerowyn's Sunbolts should be hired by the crown of Valdemar because they are a good mercenary group, that they are trustworthy. And this book is Kerowyn's arrival in Valdemar. It's one of the first discussions that we get, actually, about what happens to mages who cross the border into Valdemar, which is that they get itchier and itchier and feel like they're being watched until they go crazy and run screaming out into the night, which is what actually happens to one of Kerowyn's mages. And for the first time, we get a collision of the Valdemar that we've become used to with the outside world where magic is still a thing. And it's very, very interesting. And at the end of this book, Kerowyn does get chosen. Kerowyn does sort of agree to try to be in a relationship with Eldan and a whole bunch of other stuff. And the thing about this, which tells us exactly where this falls, is because not only is it that they beat Ankar back, as they had clearly done before the Winds trilogy hit, but it's also that Kerowyn has become the new arms mistress by the time we hit the Winds trilogy. And if you don't know that, if you haven't read By the Sword, it's a little confusing as to where this Kerowyn person came from. Well, this is where she came from. So this book falls squarely in between those two. And so that's the last I'm going to talk about this, and I will see you all next week.